Okay, hi everybody. Good morning, North America. Good afternoon, Europe. Good evening, Asia. So we've got, I'm Chris Dakin, I'm in London. With me, I've got Sam Gutterman, who's in Chicago, and Dermot Grenham, who's in Glasgow. And we're really grateful to have the opportunity of presenting our Population Issues Working Group paper, Actuarial Perspectives on World Population Prospects. So hopefully the screen will operate, although it doesn't seem to be responding at the moment. There we are. Right, so the World Population Prospects 2019 is a publication of the United Nations Population Division, and it represents their latest revision of their population projections for the whole world. With estimates of the population from 1950 to 2019 and projections from 2020 to 2100. Our paper summarizes the results of the UN projections for the benefit of actuaries and draws attention to some of the implications, commenting on the assumptions or the main assumptions and focusing on the uncertainties in those projections. So this gives a broad overview of the way in which the projections look from about 8 billion population of the world at 2020, going forward to almost 11 billion on the median projection in 2100. There's a big range. These are probabilistic variants that the UN use, and the 80% confidence interval is between 10 and 12 billion. The 95% confidence interval between about 9.5 billion and 12.5 billion. If we look at the regions, then we see that at the moment Asia is by far the largest continent and is reaching its peak in the next 20-30 years. Meanwhile, Africa is going to be growing dramatically, and that will be one of the themes of our presentation, that Africa is a place where things are changing dramatically. The UN projections bring together historical data from a huge range of sources. It's a massive undertaking. They use national censuses, records of births and deaths by country, and try and put that all together. Of course, it's all of very varied quality from country to country. Migration data is much less complete, and they've used that where they can, but also data from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on stocks and flows of refugees and asylum seekers. Now, the fundamental population projection process has four sets of assumptions, really: the starting population, the future births generated by fertility rates, and the split between males and females. And thirdly, there's future deaths, and that's based on a range of factors which we'll look at, and future net migration. And we're going to break this presentation down. I'm going to start with an overview of the projection results, then Sam will talk about fertility. I'll come back to talk about mortality, then Dermot on migration. I'll give some review of the impact on population size and structure, and then we'll briefly refer to other global population projections, giving time for questions and answer, which you can submit on the Q&A function in the box on the screen. So turning to the overview of the projections, apart from the probabilistic projections, the projections include a number of what we might call variants, where the assumptions are varied in different ways. there's one projection, for example, which assumes that constant fertility is maintained throughout the whole projection. That gives rise to almost double the population in 80 years' time. And they also have a high fertility and a low fertility projection, which are based on adding fixed amounts to the total fertility rate or subtracting fixed amounts from the fertility rate. And they also give a very wide range. So you can see that the fertility assumption is very significant and gives rise to a very large possible range of outcomes in 80 years' time. Meanwhile, mortality is looked at also on a constant mortality basis, and that's only a couple of billion lower projection in 2100 than the median projection. So the impact of mortality improvement is important, but relatively modest compared to the impact of fertility changes. Now, I've illustrated, and we illustrate most of these illustrations are in the paper itself, which you can get on the IA website. This shows the structure of the population in broad terms using population pyramids, which is quite interesting because 1950 it was genuinely a pyramid, quite a straight, narrow pyramid. But by 2020 it was bulging in the middle, and the age 30 to 34 and around there was sort of out of line with the general structure. If we look further ahead into the projection to 2060 and to 100, we see it becomes more like an onion dome than a pyramid, with by 2100 more or less the same number of people in each age group going right the way up to something like 60, and then quite a heavy number of people at the older ages compared to what we've seen in previous years. So that's just an illustration of the way the global population is aging, which we can also look at a bit later on in terms of individual regions of the world. So there is a significant change in the age structure of the population, but also in the relative sizes of individual countries and continents. Currently, 4 of the 20 largest countries are in Africa and 11 are in Asia. But going forward 80 years, the projections indicate that 10 of the 20 largest countries will be in Africa and only 4 in Asia. And all of the fastest growing countries are in Africa, with many of them growing by 3, 4, 5, or even in a few cases, nearly 6 times over 80 years. And this rapid growth is already effectively built in because of young age structure and relatively high fertility at current times. And if the fertility does not fall in the way projected, they'll grow even more than that. So we can look at the ranking, if you like, of populations in the 10 largest countries. India will, by 2100, be the top country, coming from second now. And India not growing that much, but China is projected to decline by about 25% over that period, and that removes China from being the number 1 country by about 2030 or thereabouts. And the other countries you see there, like Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Egypt, are all sort of, most of them other than Nigeria, outside the top 10 at the moment, but are projected to be among the largest countries by 80 years from now. So the other end of the spectrum, many countries are projected to fall significantly in size. I mentioned China already, and many countries in Central and Eastern Europe and some island jurisdictions are expected or projected to see the population fall by 50% or more. Again, this is already built into the current age structure of these populations, but there's also the impact of emigration, which Dermot will talk about, which is quite significant for some jurisdictions and will exacerbate the falling population size. So in 80 years' time, some countries will have seen this sort of 50% or even more reduction in their population if these projections turn out to be anything like the truth. And that includes, as you can see, a number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that brings me to a graph which appears in one of the UN publications about the projections and quite strikingly illustrates those parts of the world where the population is growing significantly. This is only over the period up to 2050, mind you, but you can see the pink colors, and particularly the dark pink colors, are countries where the population is increasing substantially. The green colors are the ones where the population is declining over that period, which includes countries like China and Russia and a large part of Europe. I'm now going to move on to introduce the other speakers. Hopefully the, oh no, there's one other aspect which I've got before I hand over to the other speakers, and that's the population of working age. Population of working age we've taken as 20 to 69, consistent with our projections looking at aged population of being over 70. Africa, and to a less important extent Oceania, show a consistent growth in this population of working age throughout the projections, whereas most of the other countries either have falling working population or a growth for a short while and then a fall. Now, this working population increase should give rise to an opportunity for economic growth, the so-called demographic dividend, but countries need to be in a position to take advantage of that situation. And of course, some of these countries that are projected to grow substantially are not particularly strong economically at the moment, and they're going to struggle to achieve the benefits of that growing population of working age. So that shows the change in the working age population. You can see the red line is for sub-Saharan Africa, which shows the strongest growth throughout the whole of the period. The other countries showing rather less strong growth, or growth only for a short period up to 2040 or 2050, and then decline thereafter. So the fertility section, I'm handing over to Sam.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome to this webinar on this topic that is quite important in many fields of actuarial science, particularly those involved in social insurance. And Chris really identified the key driver of long-term population growth in the world, and that is fertility. It's an assumption that actuaries typically, other than social insurance actuaries, don't pay that much attention to, but I think it's worthwhile in terms of understanding a better grip, or getting a better grip of demographic forces as we go forward. And particularly, as Chris mentioned, the variation in long-term population is indeed the fertility assumption. Before I start with a couple of minutes worth of discussion of fertility, a few key definitions for those not familiar with this field. First is the total fertility rate. That is the average number of births for a woman over her lifetime, unadjusted for mortality. It's typically that the population drivers and incentives of women are the drivers of long-term and any fertility growth. So therefore, you'll see commonly, I hate to say this because the presenters are white males. The real important demographic factor is the behavior of women. And this total fertility rate can be measured in two different ways, on a period basis or a cohort basis. For those familiar a lot with the discussions on mortality, this is the same type of distinction. A period basis is a snapshot of a given period, which is usually a year, and looks at age-specific experience of fertility of females in terms of giving birth. A cohort follows a series or a category of mothers by their birth year over that group's lifetime. The real underlying fertility is the cohort basis, but because of the timeliness of the measurement, it's commonly projected in terms of a period basis. An important factor is the replacement rate. That is the natural replacement rate of a population. That is a TFR of 2.1. Together with mortality, that's the fertility point that would lead to a stable population. So that's a benchmark for which is commonly fertility is commonly compared against. There are two aspects of fertility. One is referred to as the quantum of fertility, that's the number of births, and the tempo, which is an age-specific fertility rates. In many countries, women give birth at a later point in time, and therefore changes in tempo are very important and is in fact is the key determinant or the difference between a period and cohort basis. Next slide. Next slide. Countries have, in terms of the UN projections, have gone through basically three different phases, and that's important for modeling purposes. The first is the high fertility or pre-transition period. TFRs or fertility rates are often greater than 5.5 per female, and they're not uncommon. Often the country is highly rural in this phase, and the United Nations projections indicates that there are no countries currently in phase one, but this was the dominant phase, let's say going back a century or two ago. Skipping to the low fertility post-transition period, that is where you've got the fertility rate of less than the long-term replacement rate of 2.1. An increasing number of countries are currently in phase three. And as I'll mention, that the projection in the long term of these people or these countries in that transition, post-transition phase of 1.78 children per birth per woman. And that leaves the large transition period between phase one and phase three, which the majority of countries are currently in. Sub-Saharan African countries particularly are things that are really the key driver of areas of uncertainty in population changes, with the highest TFR in the current period of almost 5 per woman. It's projected by the UN at the end of the century down to about 2.16, or just about the replacement rate. So therefore, ultimately in these populations, we see African countries, or at least the average of African countries, getting down to almost replacement rate. But it's the transition, or that middle phase, which is the controversial phase in demographic projections over the long term. Next slide. Once a country has a low fertility rate, at least based on our experience worldwide, it is really difficult to increase it again. It's referred to as a fertility trap. This may change over time, and we'll discuss this for a very short time, but it's several countries have already tried to increase their low fertility rates, but with relatively limited success. Most have, with family-friendly policies, promoting more births, have moved their fertility rate up slightly, but usually only successfully for a couple of years, rather than having a more success at this huge demographic factor. This shows that culture, I think this is my personal conclusion, is culture is stronger than governmental rules. In other words, people's behavior is the key driver rather than governmental dictates. A prime example is in the China situation, where they've unloosened their rules, but their birth rate, if anything, has gone down. Next. This is a pictorial description of just the total fertility rate by country. And you'll notice, as we've mentioned, the sub-Saharan Africa, which is in the purple or very dark blue, depending on whether you're colorblind, like I am. That's the area that with the highest population growth or fertility right now. The prime mover is Mali with a fertility rate of about 7. But a lot of countries, particularly in Northern America, US and Canada, Europe, and parts of China, of Asia, the population is already under or at the replacement rate. So this is just a pictorial diagram of the United Nations, or of current assessments prepared by United Nations. Next. This is the fertility projection, not overall population, but you can see the two top lines as being in particularly the sub-Saharan Africa and the remainder of total Africa, which is the top 2 lines. And you can see that transition period between the present and the end of the century. And it's really that line, how deep or how quickly that transition is occurring is the key driver of uncertainty in global population. The other areas, if you'll notice, the United Nations projects that even the lowest category right now, which is Europe and in certain parts of Asia, matter of fact, some parts are actually below for the natural reproduction rate, replacement rate. Now it's a ever so slightly increase, but on average, for those countries now below replacement rate, the average, as I mentioned before, has a total fertility rate of 1.78. Chris? Next. However, there are alternative projections, and Chris will get into this somewhat in the future, but a paper that just came out a couple of months ago with the initial primary author being Volset, resulted in far lower fertility rates. In particular, they transitioned most African countries, particularly sub-African countries, more rapidly the United Nations projection, and therefore came out with a significantly different and lower fertility rate than the United Nations did. It basically, based on its assumptions, based on rapid urbanization, urban women had typically, as a generalization, has much lower fertility rates than the rural population, and young girls and female education. This is also deemed by most demographers and actuaries who are involved as a key driver. And an area that we think that is something that the United Nations in the future should pay more attention to is the individual national population projections that have also been less than in the United Nations. One example that I'll give is Japan. Japan, based on its projection, has a projection of 1.6 for females. That is, as they have recently gone into a declining population period. The national projections that are made by Japan's demographic unit in their government is a projection of 1.45 in the year 2065, while Volset has 1.38. This is verging on what's referred to as the ultra low fertility rate, and this is something that is significant. And one of the things that drives what Chris mentioned before is a starkly declining population in certain countries. And so we contend that national projections, being closer to the underlying data, should be more accurate than the general methodology applied by the UN. Chris? Uncertainty is key, as Chris mentioned. Over the long term, there may be greater disagreement on fertility than other demographic assumptions. As mentioned, it makes a tremendous difference over the next couple of generations. As a result, the United Nations performed 6 alternative fertility scenarios. Chris mentioned a median variant, but these alternative variants, and particularly those that are that drive a much lower fertility rate is key. So this is something that if you look at population projections, you should pay a lot of attention to. Next. And that ends my presentation. I'll move it back to Chris to talking about the actuarial topic of mortality.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. I'm hoping that I can control the screen, but it doesn't seem to be responding. Oh, there it is. Off we go. So on the mortality front, which is obviously dear to many actuaries' hearts and more familiar area, expectation of life at birth is the key driver in the world population prospects projections. I'll come back to how they do the assumptions a bit later, but expectation of life has clearly increased everywhere and is projected to continue to increase throughout the projection period. Just a slight dip in the rate of growth for sub-Saharan Africa as a result of HIV/AIDS. If we look at the picture, we can see that the projections to 2100 are more or less linear growth of the expectation of life at birth. I think from an actuarial perspective, that seems maybe the wrong thing to focus on, and we'll come back to that in a few moments. But that's, of course, very much of interest when you're looking at total population, because one of the major factors in mortality, if you look at it from a total population point of view, is the infant mortality and the mortality in the early years, which is a key element of the expectation of life at birth, and is something which has been changing dramatically over the past years. So we can see both for males and for females that the expectation of life at birth has been rising steadily and is projected to continue to increase steadily, so that expectation of life for females rises to about 94 in the most favored region. We've used what the UN are calling Sustainable Development Goal regions as a simple way of separating out the different types of region. The top line in turquoise is Australia and New Zealand, followed by the Europe and North America line, and then quite a long way behind Africa and Oceania, where the expectation of life at birth for females only rises to 78 over this period. If we look at the infant mortality, that has fallen very dramatically over the historical period considered, both at under age 1 and between age 1 and age 5, and is projected to continue falling everywhere around the world. And that's a major factor behind what comes out as a linear growth in the expectation of life at birth. The pattern of deaths between 15 and 60 has been broken by the AIDS epidemic. We'll look at that in a moment in relation to African countries, where the projections from the UN have a separate module to project the impact of AIDS, and it really only relevant for a sort of block of African countries, and has passed the peak of its importance. And it's sort of working its way out as we look into the future projections from 2020 onwards. So that's the mortality rate for infants, the under age 1 mortality rate, showing the steady decline. Still a big difference between those countries which have the most favorable mortality rates and those who have the least favorable, i.e. between Australia and New Zealand on the one hand and Africa on the other. This shows the female deaths between age 15 and 60, and you can see the disturbance of the steady decline. Northern Africa has it as it should be. The other countries are showing bulges around 1990, 1995, 2000, and into the beginning of the 21st century, resulting from the impact of HIV and AIDS. Now, the mortality assumptions that they use are developed by starting off with modeling female expectation of life at birth as a factor. It's a bit of a strange way of doing things from an actuarial perspective. They don't look at the mortality rates, they come out at the end. They model female expectation of life, which they see as going up steadily, as we've seen. They then model the gap between male and female expectation of life at birth in order to get to male expectation of life at birth. Then they develop mortality rates by 5-year periods. They add in the AIDS factor, and then they interpolate to get single year age and period rates to do the projections for the future. So it's a little bit upside down from a typical actuarial perspective. And I think one of the factors which we thought was a slightly unsatisfactory result of this process was that they really don't give very close attention to mortality at the older ages, because that's just something that falls out from the process rather than something that they put in as an input. We have the next one. Yeah, this is looking at female expectation of life at age 70. And here we can see something which is of particular interest to actuaries and to people who are working on Social Security and pensions. It's just how long people are going to live in the future. And you can see that the expectation of life for females in 80 years' time is projected to be sort of pretty well up to 25 in the top countries. And in fact, if you look at those countries which are absolutely the highest, it's a little bit more than that. Whereas Africa is still languishing around sort of under 14 to 15 expectation of life at 70 for females in 80 years' time, which is quite a big difference, almost half of the most favored countries in this respect. The males are, as one might expect, somewhat lower. The relationship between the different regions is still similar, but the male expectation of life at 70 is just over 20 in Europe, North America, and about 22 in Australia and New Zealand. So I did include some thoughts about our concerns about the mortality assumptions. We don't think that the projections really give sufficient attention to what's happening in older ages, and they ignore the fact that mortality has actually been slowing down. The improvement of mortality has been slowing down in many countries in recent years. And the UN approach seems to have been to say this is just a blip and it will go back to where it was increasing before. And we think that that may give rise to slightly contentious results in terms of ignoring the actual changes which are taking place, where there may well be evidence of reduced improvement rates in those countries which have enjoyed particularly high improvement rates in past years. So I now hand over to Dermot, who will look at the migration aspect.
Thank you very much, Chris, and hello, everyone. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the international migration projections done by the United Nations. This is sometimes a little bit ignored by others, apart from the United States, partly because the data itself on which they base assumptions is problematic at times. In often cases, the impact is not so significant, and also because at times it's politically sensitive. So for those reasons, it's sometimes not given the same level of treatment as fertility and mortality that we've been hearing about. But there is one thing we know for sure, and that's that at a global level, net migration has to be zero. So whatever assumptions are made, the UN and anyone else projecting global migration needs to make sure that the movements in and out of countries add up to zero. Apart from that, projections, and actually even the historic data can at times be such that what we know about migration is very speculative, both at a regional and even more so at individual country level. Globally, we're broadly aware that international migrants make up about 3.5% of the global population, although clearly it can be a much higher portion in some countries. A country neighboring on a country at war, at civil war, can often be overwhelmed with refugees coming from the war-torn zones. And although, as I mentioned, migration may not have a significant effect in many situations, nonetheless, in countries with low fertility, the impact could actually be quite significant. If we could have the next slide. So this is just looking at the UK, and the line at the top is the overall net change, and the columns are comparing natural change, births minus deaths, against net international migration and any other movements. And you can see that in a number of years, it's actually the migration that's had a bigger impact. And certainly in the UK, that's been quite a political issue in recent years and potentially in the coming years as well. So next slide, please. If we look at the net historical migration levels, and these should be rates rather than levels. So this is showing the percentage movements, and the blue line is the high income countries, and you can see that they are all positive. So basically net movement into those countries, whereas the low and lower income countries are seeing, broadly speaking, movements out, with specifically at the low income countries, a lot of volatility from year to year, often depending on situations of violence or war. Next slide. So as regards the methodology applied by the United Nations, they project net movements rather than immigration and emigration separately. So they just look at each country and decide and try and work out assumptions for what will be the net migration movements for that country. They make use of a number of sources. Chris referred to some of these earlier. So there's the official country level estimates of migration or its component parts, information on labor migration, and for some countries that's actually quite significant. Some of the Middle Eastern countries receive very large amounts of labor migration from Asian countries. Then there's trying to get data about undocumented or irregular migrants, including also refugees and asylum seekers from, as Chris mentioned, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And then there's looking at current stocks of foreign-born persons. And when trying to project migration rates, the UN also take into account the government's current views on the levels of immigration and whether they consider that being too high, about right, or too low. And the United Nations make assumptions about what sort of policies and their effectiveness may be brought in. Next slide. So the overall broad level assumption is that current levels, assuming they've been fairly stable, continue until the middle of the century, and then they'll remain stable until the end. In the previous projections that the UN carried out, they assumed that they would fall by half the level for the second half of this century. However, the country's government's views are taken into account when doing that. And when looking at refugees, the general assumption is that they would return to their own country, their home country, within 5 to 10 years. And if the country is expected to experience movement of both refugees and other international migrants, then they were added together to give an overall assumption about net migration in future. So moving on. And then when bringing this together into the overall population projections, the distribution by age and gender can actually have quite a significant impact. Labor migration, for example, into Middle East is often just males. So that will have a relatively limited impact on fertility in those countries, but clearly an impact on fertility in the countries that workforce has come from. Where they can estimate the age and gender distribution, they do so. Otherwise, they just make some general assumptions about that sort of distribution. And then they bring those together with the fertility and mortality assumptions to project the overall population projection. Next slide. And these are the projected, again, migration rates. And you can see that they are very stable, even though we can expect that over the coming years and decades that they're going to be much more volatile than that. And that migration is assumed effectively to be from the low and lower middle income countries into the higher income countries, which is generally what one sees at the current time. Next slide. And then when reviewing the United Nations projections, although we're, as actuaries, we don't tend to look at migration that much, perhaps feel that the previous projection assumptions about a decline later in the century might have been a bit more realistic. The assumptions about the reversal of flows, particularly in terms of refugees, may be a little bit too optimistic about how quickly they'll return to their countries, given how the experience we've got of refugee camps surviving longer than perhaps we would have expected. And then the alternative assumptions in the other mortality projections that have been referred to already, that there's a completely different approach to modeling international migration being taken. And we think looking at that, perhaps that is providing more realistic patterns of migration, which fall gradually over time, particularly in the second half of the century. Although I think we all have to admit that uncertainties around pandemics, natural disasters, wars and conflicts means that whatever assumptions we make now are likely to prove wide of the mark as we head into the later parts of this century. But I now have to hand back to Chris, who will, sorry, just a final thing, again, a bit like Sam did with fertility. I pulled out some of the differences in assumptions between various countries to show how the United Nations assumptions about net migration compared to alternatives. And you can see that in some countries they're quite close, for example, Japan, they're on the left, but the United States, quite different. And therefore, these things are going to drive quite different levels of population projections when they're projected over time. So I will hand over to Chris to pull this all together.
Thank you. Well, I now want to just look at the overall size and structure of the population. We saw population pyramids earlier for the global population. This shows the picture for in some of the individual regions. Africa is showing the same characteristics as the world as a whole. It turns into a bit of a like an onion dome rather than a pyramid. In the current position in Africa, it is quite sort of indented pyramid rather than a straight pyramid. If we look at the situation in Europe, that's already in 2020 quite a well-developed, mature population with more people in the middle ages, middle age groups than the younger age groups. And that sort of squashes out into a very narrow and pretty solid pyramid with more or less straight sides by 2100. We look at Asia, then the situation is even more extreme in terms of the development in 2100, where the older ages are significantly more than the younger ages, reflecting a drop in fertility rates over the projection period. And then we move on to a particularly strong situation in Japan, as I haven't for the most part shown individual countries, but Japan has got one of the most extreme changes of the population pyramid to be a very narrow and on a narrow base in 2100. So moving on to the support ratios, there's more of this in the paper, of course, both in terms of the old age dependency ratio, which we use in the paper, and the support ratio, which is a number of people of economically active ages supporting the population over age 70. And here, as one might expect, the support ratios are declining pretty well for all countries, but from a particularly high level in Africa and Oceania, but still falling to a pretty low level by the end of the projection period. And the other aspect which I want to bring out for today, for the next slide, yes, please, is the growth of the over age 70 population. So, and particularly the over 80s and the over 90s. The green bar there is the 80 to 90 age group, which is growing very substantially over this 80-year projection period. And the over 90s as well. And even the centenarians. If we look at the next slide, we can see that the population over age 80, that's right up from 80 onwards, is expected to grow by a multiple of 6 in the 80-year projection period. Population over 90 by a multiple of 11, and the population over 100 growing from a rather modest 500,000 at the moment to 19 million, 33 times higher by 2100. So next slide, we move on just to a very brief comparison of the world population projections of the UN with other possibilities. The WPP 2019 are by far the best known, and they have the most comprehensive information published on all the assumptions. Everything is available on their website, very easily accessible. There is this study which we've referred to in the presentation already, which appeared in the Lancet in July. It's called the Global Burden of Use Study. It's prepared by the IHME, Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in the state of Washington in the US. Also, some projections are used by the Institute or International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And they've been the ones that have primarily been used by the climate change scientists. So next slide, please. Just gives a broad comparison of the different projections. We haven't carried out a comprehensive comparison since we were mainly looking at the UN projections. That was the focus of our study. But we did look at some comparisons with the IHME, already been mentioned that they project significantly lower fertility rates for most countries. They have lower expectations of life at birth for many countries, and lower international migration, with flows reducing over time. And what we liked about the IHME study is that they do relate back the projections to other factors like economic factors and educational factors and things which drive the assumptions rather than just making statistical projections of trends. Next slide, please. Just gives a very broad indication of the differences for some countries. Some countries, the differences are quite small, but you can see for India and China, the IHME projections are about a quarter lower than the WPP 2019. And other countries like Japan and Canada and Italy are also 20% lower or thereabouts. And only for a few countries are their projections higher than the UN, and that's included France to a very slight extent, mainly driven by the migration assumption, I think, and Nigeria. So that, I think, leads us to some general conclusions which we would like to offer for actuaries from our study. The amount of information in the WPP 2019 is impressive. There's a comprehensive set of data there, both about the past and projections for the future. But I think for the use of actuaries in doing social security work and other work which looks at future population changes, we need to be a bit cautious about the assumptions that are being made and review the fertility projections, which we've already seen are subject to a very high degree of uncertainty, mortality assumptions, which don't really pay enough attention to the older age groups and to the way in which mortality improvement may be changing. And the migration, which, as Dermot has pointed out, it just assumes continuation of current levels for many countries, whereas it might be more realistic to assume a trailing off of that level of international migration if you're looking 80 years ahead. And we think if you're looking at particular countries, you should see whether individual national statistical institutions have done work, who else might have made projections, what are the factors which are relevant when you look at individual countries. It was a big task for the UN because they're looking at all the countries in the world, and that means they've got to simplify to some extent in order to make the work tractable. For the European countries, Eurostat also publish projections. They've just brought out a new set of projections based on 2020, which are going to be used in the aging report by the European Commission next year. And actuaries in general should consider whether they should make their own projections in terms of any analysis that they're going to do. I think that brings me to the end of our presentation. We've got 10 minutes left or so for questions. And Christian, I think you were going to sort of point us in the direction of the questions. I can see there's one come in about what were the other factors in determining population growth other than fertility and mortality rates. Well, I think those are the things that determine population growth, but it's what determines the fertility and mortality rates, which is significant. And there the UN don't really take into account economic factors, whereas the IHME projections, which we've referred to, do. And they, I don't know whether, Sam, you want to say anything about economic factors relating to fertility rates?
In general, the better the economy, the fewer number of births or the lower fertility rates. That has been a traditional keystone assumption as overall standards of living in the world have improved, that has driven fertility rates to go down. And the obvious question is, what's the future economy of Africa going to be in terms of overall population growth? Very key assumption, a lot of differences of opinion. Some people believe that Africa is going to be vibrant because of its youthful population. Others feel that they're going to have to be challenged by the a high unemployment rate of their youth, with potentially a pressure on emigration from Africa to other parts of the world, with possibly some political pushback. So economy is underlying the fertility assumptions. I don't think it has much effect on mortality, but it also has a potential effect on international country immigration. Dermot, any comments on that, on the migration side?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Sam. I think economics influences a lot of migration. And I can pick up a later question as well about climate change. Might as well bring those two things together on migration. Because good economic performance in one country reduces immigration probably, but also potentially increases immigration because other people want to come, or that country itself needs more people to work there. But also, as we look forward and the potential of climate change, the question is, a lot of uncertainty is around what level of climate change are we going to experience. If we can keep global temperatures below that increase of 1.5%, there will be hopefully less stress on the environment and therefore less climate change refugees. But if we can't, then we might find there is more immigration and movement of populations within countries as they move, say, from coasts inland, but also between countries. So I think there's an awful lot of factors behind the actual migration assumptions, just like they are behind the mortality and fertility assumptions you've mentioned.
Thank you, Dermot. I think I'd perhaps pick up on another of the questions, which is about the Volset study. A couple of questions about this. We have referred to the Volset study in several places in our report, and I think we were quite impressed by the Volset study in the way in which it tried to relate the assumptions to underlying changes such as educational development for women affecting fertility, and the economic factors which would drive both migration and fertility. So it seemed to be, if you like, a more intelligent use of the possible drivers of population projections rather than the UN ones, which are largely based on sort of extrapolating trends, if I can simplify the very complex process that they use. So I think that the IHME projections are certainly worth further study. Maybe we shall do more work on that, because it seems that they have a lot of sense behind them.
One of the factors that is obvious in any of these assumptions or any of these projections is the high level of uncertainty. And I think in order to dig into and identify your own credibility of these studies is to look at those sensitivities and look at what the primary drivers are. Most of the studies that have been presented, or the Volset and the United Nations, are very clear about what their assumptions are. And I think that the key differences are, well, take that back. The key differences in terms of global overall long-term assumptions, as mentioned, is the fertility assumption. And I think that's understanding that is really crucial in my mind in terms of trying to drive the level of uncertainty, or reduce the level of uncertainty between the multiple projections. I think that the question on climate change, the impact is a relationship between climate change and fertility, is so far maybe an understudied area. Very difficult to tell because as all these factors are, is they're multifaceted, they're complex. Climate change has a number of factors that are involved. I know the IAA is active in looking at some of these in terms of the alternative scenarios that are utilized in actuarial projections. So the one thing you come away with is the interrelationship of these projections and these assumptions. The fact that mortality and fertility are actually quite interdependent. The correlation is high. So therefore, it's useful in my mind to study these other factors, which normally actuaries wouldn't get deeply involved with. But I think it drives home the fact that these underlying drivers are going to be key in terms of future population change, and particularly the issue of population aging, which actuaries are very much involved with, are going to be very driven by these underlying demographic factors.
Thanks, Sam. I mean, I've spent a lot of my working life involved in population projections, and I know how uncertain they can be and how difficult it is to manage the assumptions. I think the key takeaway from an actuarial perspective is that you shouldn't pin any of your work on a single set of projections. You have to understand the uncertainty and need to have policies which are resilient to potentially quite wide range of possible outcomes. And that's certainly true in relation to the mortality of the elderly, but it's very much the case in relation to migration and fertility, which are so much more uncertain, really, when you're looking as far ahead as 80 years as we are with these projections. I think there's a question for Dermot from Richard Deville. It says, Dermot, can you explain the French migration figures, 68,300 versus the 44,600 for IHME? I think.
Yes, Richard, if I understand the question correctly, the table I showed was comparing the projected number of migrants in 2000 into the year 2100 as projected by the United Nations in WPP 2019 against the Volset projection. So United Nations was saying it'd be 68,000 migrants into France that year, whereas the alternative was saying it was 44,000.
I think a lot of that is due to immigration from Africa, and in terms of trends of that movement. So I think that's a key driver in that differences of assumption.
Yeah, and certainly France has got, obviously it's got its
IHME projections, as we've mentioned, do make allowance for drivers of economic change in different countries, and they do assume a sort of tailing off in the way that we said might be a sensible thing, rather than assuming that migration continues at the same level for the whole projection period. I think we're coming towards the end of our time allocation, but we've got a question here about, if we looked at the projections prepared 50 years ago, how accurate would these have turned out to be? I had no idea for the UN projections. We haven't done that exercise. I know similar exercises have been carried out on the UK projections, and some of the most accurate forecasts were made about 50 years ago, and then they got worse. But it all depends on how much you take into account sort of recent trends, and whether reacting to recent trends is a good thing to do or not.
Just briefly on the population or the fertility area, key difference, I think, in about 1970 was a very highly publicized study of Paul Ehrlich on the population bomb, came out really drastic projections, and also by the Club of Rome on terms of overpopulation. That was a very crucial in a lot of the discussions back in my early period of life, in terms of concerns about overpopulation. In some areas, now it's the exact opposite. So although globally it hasn't been that terrible, I think that the emphasis and use of these projections have changed dramatically. And so I think that we'll see future evolution of both projections and implications, and in some cases, action around the world.
Okay, so we've got one final question, which we're going to take, and that's, has HIV/AIDS had an impact on fertility and mortality? And has the impact of COVID-19 been described anywhere? And did the Spanish flu have much impact a century ago? So a quick answer from the mortality point of view, HIV/AIDS certainly has had an impact on mortality in the African region, and that is modeled specifically in the UN projections. Elsewhere in the world, the impact is much less significant and isn't the subject of a particular element of the projections. COVID-19, I think it's too early to say. Sorts of views coming out about that, and that will be a factor. One of the things we put in our study was say, well, really the projections from the UN don't make any allowance for the possibility of major disturbances like global pandemics. I don't know whether, Sam, you want to say anything briefly about the impact of HIV/AIDS on the fertility side?
I haven't seen too much on the impact, even though it's had a huge impact on mortality, and it's really overlooked. 20 million plus died from AIDS over the last several decades. A very, very significant overall impact, but it hasn't had as much impact on fertility as you might think. The COVID projections, actuaries are just looking at it. I've seen a couple of recent projections, but most of them have been focused on the short term, over the next 2 to 3 years. Very little quantitative discussions on terms of COVID for the long-term future, although there's a lot of speculation right now on it. But there is a short-term variation, and I know social insurance systems are going to suffer because of loss of revenue and contributions, but that's also just over the next couple of years, at least right now. Pandemics are really significant in the short term, but the jury's still out about the long-term projections. But one thing is that one of the big significant factors in demography is really on fertility rates, really depressing fertility rates around the world. At least my expectation will be, but that will be presumably only for a couple of years as well. So that'll depress overall population projections, but not materially over the long-term future.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Sam and Dermot for their presentations and their participation in producing the paper, which we hope people will read, as well as listening to the webinar. Thank you those who have joined us today for participating. If you have any further questions, you can always direct them individually to myself or to Sam or to Dermot or to all three of us, and we'll seek to answer anything that comes our way. I believe a recording of the webinar will be put up on the website alongside the paper, so that people will be able to access it through the IEA website, and hopefully it will stimulate some interest in the actuarial community in the whole question of population projections and the way in which the world population is possibly going to grow or change over the next coming years. So thank you all very much for your participation, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.